I actually tried not doing music because my idea of what the music business was full of debauchery and, you know, this riotous living, because that's all I saw, you know.
So, Branden, if no one knows, I mean, what's interesting about like fame, or you're looking to someone who has quote or unquote made it.
Right.
It's easy. It's very easy, and I'm guilty of this. Thinking, oh man, they just must have the best life.
Oh yeah,
like
right.
They are on top of the world.
Yeah, when we're on the other side. Yeah, it's easy to think that in all regards. And I'm sure in all different types of work and it's we're always looking up, right? Of like what's next, or the that disease of I'll be happy when.
Yeah, that is a serious one.
Yeah, and
plagued daily. I'm plagued daily by that.
Yeah, and of course, to have success in your field and do those things, those are happening, but that doesn't mean that everything else goes away. Especially if you want to, have a multifaceted life and still, when we're part of entertainment, and it requires so much, especially with the traveling and trying to capture lightning in a bottle, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It can be easy to isolate, but if you choose to, really make sure that you don't lose that connection with your family and want to be involved, then there's a lot going on.
Okay,
and especially to be a dad, and to and a good partner and a spouse, it requires a lot,
So tell me about your family.
Yeah, so I'm married to my high school sweetheart, Emily Patterson, and I mean we met in the 6th grade. So for us, that was 1986.
Oh, that's a good year.
That's when the Beastie Boys' "Licensed to Ill" came out. And in Las Vegas at the time, when it came time for 6th grade, there was a weird integration that the city was doing, or the school district, because for all of the other grades, kids from maybe like low-income neighborhoods were bused into the suburbs to different schools. And they saw the opportunity to, in 6th grade, let's have all the kids go to 6th grade centers that are now in those neighborhoods, to give the kids there the opportunity to be at school in their own vicinity. And so you all of a sudden ended up in a 6th grade with kids from, all over the city. And met Emily, and then we went to different junior highs and part of high school. And high school met up again, and I had a crush on her friend, and she had a crush on one of my friends. We just had this big fun circle of friends, and my friend kept telling me, "Yeah, Emily, Emily." I'm like, "No, I don't think I do. I don't know who you're talking about." And then once I saw her, I was like, "Yeah, of course I know her," and we became fast friends. We were friends first, which I think made for a way better, time dating and everything because there wasn't, this guard up. The guard was already down, becoming friends, and just everything. So, on and off, like we dated, but eventually she came up here to go to school, and for me, I wasn't, like I had mentioned, I wasn't part of the LDS church.
Were you religious at all at this point?
Oh no. I did believe in in a higher power. And I can look back, and I did have a belief and understanding of Jesus Christ, and I can remember that specifically it was my paternal grandmother, so my dad's mom, teaching me about the Savior's sacrifices. I can remember being in their living room, she was probably babysitting me. It was just me and her. But also my mom too, talking about it just briefly, There was a time when I was about 12, or maybe like 11, that my mom was trying to get involved in a church. Her sister was Catholic. My dad grew up Catholic, and I think she wanted to be part of that. But she was really on her own because my dad didn't want to go, and they didn't have a great youth program. We did try to go to. They did have a youth night, and I remember going, and they did a mock confession. And here I am with like a priest, and he's like, but it was very casual, It wasn't like we see, like it wasn't like we see in the movies with the divider and everything. But it was like, let's just talk about something that like you could improve. I think they're good questions, but I was like, what, I'm 11 years old. Like what, how can I be refined? And of course, the first thing I think, well, of course I could be nicer to my brothers. I have a younger brother and an older brother, but it was very short lived. And, so there was no, spiritual guidance in our house. And my dad was very closed off. It was, he never shared his feelings. He was quick to show if he was mad about something, Anyways, so, Emily came up here to go to school. I had been learning about the gospel, and we can get into that later, but eventually I did join and went on a mission. Emily went on a mission. We didn't see each other for over 3 years. By that time, I knew a lot more people where I felt like, hey, like I could move to Provo, and I did. And Emily and I eventually got married, and we have 3 kids. We have Katie, Connor, and Jacob. They're all spread out. Initially, because after Katie was born, Emily had some back issues. She had a fractured disc, so she couldn't.
Is this from childbirth?
It was probably a variety of things, but Katie was like barely like 1.
Yeah.
So she, so it took a while before, she had to have surgery and everything to get the disc repaired and stuff. And so it took a little while before we could have Connor. And Connor was born from day 1 having epilepsy, which led to autism. And so it's us, figuring out what's going on with him. Within that same year, we also decided that I should do music full time. And so that whole journey started to where, it was about 9 years before Jacob came,
Yeah.
Yeah. So they're all spread out. And which is hard enough on its own, but what makes it even more difficult is that Connor is, he's 15 now, but he's more like a 2-year-old. So Katie and Jacob do not have a normal relationship with him.
Yeah, what's Connor like?
Tasmanian devil, like from Looney Tunes. No, he's a sweetheart because you know what they say, like when you meet a kid with autism, you've met a kid with autism. And it's, for I'd say like the first 6-7 years with a situation like his, we're working on, well, how can we, ultimately you think, how can we fix this? So his brain is experiencing numerous seizures all the time. His brain pattern.
All the time?
His brain scans look like a wildfire.
Is this why he doesn't talk, right?
He doesn't talk. He's still diapered. He didn't use his pincer grasp till he was like almost 5. So like a baby, like to pick up a Cheerio or to hold his own bottle. And it's these things where at first it's there's stuff that babies don't even do. Like, of course, you don't know he's not going to talk, and you meet people that are optimistic and. Yeah, my son didn't talk till he was 5, and now he's the president of Stanford. But to put it in layman's terms, you think of a computer, starting up, and now you're downloading, a file, but the computer crashes, right? So it's basically, and then it's starting back up, and now let's download a little more. So it takes, it took him 5 years to, just to use his pincer grasp. So his motor skills and cognitive skills are just majorly delayed.
What are you thinking when you said you were trying to fix it?
Yeah, and that's a transition to where it's first like, okay, because you think, well, we could outgrow it. or we could try, we can try different, medications. I mean, he's an anomaly. He failed everything, and even to where we're at the Cleveland Clinic, which is like a Mayo Clinic or Johns Hopkins, but this place specializes in pediatric neurology and looking at could we find like that ember of like what's causing this and remove that from his brain. Anything that he's learned so far will redirect.
Has that happened with other children?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So that's how we found out that there is no, one, it's everywhere. So even when we think of a seizure, we think a grand mal, right? We think of someone on the floor, convulsing, and he does have those. But he has so many other mild ones that you can't even see that are happening, and so it's going through all that and being optimistic that there could be a way to work with that or to improve just his brain and his lifestyle until he's about 6 or 7 and realize, oh no, this is irretractable.
And how old is he now?
He's 15.
He's 15. So
he'll be 16 in April. Yeah.
That's crazy.
So it's been, like when when we're new parents and we're like, wow, another diaper, or this or another, not sleeping through the night. And that does go away. We've been like 15 years straight.
What do you do
that with Connor? And as he's gotten older and bigger and stronger, everything else is bigger and stronger,
Yeah. No, he's a big kid. So he has severe special needs. What do you do to help your other kids feel like, because I'm sure he gets the most attention, right?
Oh yeah.
Just out of necessity. What do you do for the other kids to make them feel loved?
It's making sure that they see that they matter, because anything that we're doing would get sidetracked by Connor.
Yeah.
Or because eventually we realized, okay, it's preventative maintenance. So we learned the hard way that, if we're not shadowing him, and he does have a dirty diaper, like anyone, he doesn't like that, but he's just going to just take it off wherever. Whatever we're doing with the other kids, like gets put on pause, right away, where it's like, oh, Connor, this. Oh, well, we have to go to Connor, or now we can't go tonight because of Connor, Yeah. Or to even sit down and have a family dinner. If something is going on with Connor, then one of the parents has to get up to go take care of that. And any special needs family or any, or even people that end up taking care of their parents, or they have a spouse that ends up, being sick or, ends up in an accident or whatever, you get caregiver burnout. Mm-hmm. But you're guilty to say that. You feel guilty to say that, right?
Totally, yeah.
And especially as a teenager, so she's dealt with that, but ultimately has been the best big sister / nurse. Jacob, on the other hand, has always felt threatened by Connor.
Because, physically, or what do you mean?
Yeah. Because if Connor gets triggered, he can't control his muscles, and he even if he doesn't mean to, sometimes he'll pull hair or he'll hit. Like we say, hey, like I want to punch you right now, but we know, like, hey, like I can't do that. His brain doesn't work like that, so he can't, stop his arm halfway through or whatever, and so sometimes there's hits or slaps or even he wants to be paid attention to. And Jacob thinks, well, if I don't talk to him, he won't bother me. But it's the opposite. If you're not seeing me, I want to make sure you see me. And the stress that it's put on us. I mean, I from being his caregiver, like I contracted this H. pylori infection that put me in the hospital. Like,
is this what happened this last year?
Yeah, on my deathbed, and I don't blame him. And I wasn't showing the normal signs because I wasn't bleeding out. I had, through working with having Connor, and we have sleep deprivation, we have the stress at home. Yeah. So many things that I said, well, this is probably why I'm not feeling normal. Yeah. Before saying oh, I'm getting deathly ill. Yeah. We had so much going on to it, that was so intense that of course that's the reason why. you know? And so now we do have him, in a facility. It's a place we waited a long time to get him into. And at first, we thought he wouldn't be able to. And so we had to look at other places, and they weren't compatible. And we thought only if he could be in, this place. And then we get the call that he's accepted, and it's just bittersweet. Because it's like, oh, well, that's what we wanted. Yeah. But, it's living with grief, and that's been something for me to learn, and to understand, like, and how it's, affected me over the years. I can think of as the band has worked and developed over the years, it would seem like every time that I left, that it would be either as I was leaving or the next day, Connor would end up in the hospital. Do
you think there's a connection to you leaving? Or just seem that way?
I just, it wasn't every time, it's, so it's a lot of for me to process and to do it in a healthy way. So it's taken a lot, but, ultimately right now, as we talk about the future, to circle back to your question, we are in the place that we had looked at for a long time as we, pondered what the future would be. And that's, for him, to have the structure that he needs. And it's also, for our family, and for our other kids, they have the potential to do so much more, and we'll adjust, but it's never going to feel normal.
Yeah.
But there was a time, when I talked about that transition from how can we fix this or mitigate, some of the issues to, well, let's buckle in because now this is forever. I was angry. Yeah. I was angry at the universe. I thought, like, how, the first thought is, why does this kid need to suffer like that? What's the purpose? Where's this in the plan? But I saw the example of my wife, who had dealt with some hard things, over her life, where she saw that, that's not the way. We need the tender mercies. We need the connections to the heavens, and it's okay to not know why. Those things will be revealed, but for now, the anger, isn't the way. And I'm grateful for that, because one thing I never want to do is ever have Connor's situation be viewed or what I translate it in my life as a victim.
Yeah.
I'm a victim to his situation. If anything, like at the end of the day, if I could put my spiritual hat on for a second, it's a blessing, where, there is this hard situation that we go through, but let's talk about the refining process that can happen through that.
I have a question about that.
Yeah.
So I've actually been studying this concept of, instead of asking God to change a situation, I guess the higher principle is asking God to change you or make you stronger or make you adapt, which I think you were leading to that. Yeah. Maybe. Yeah. So keep going on that.
Yeah. It is that. It's, understanding this isn't going to change, and, how do I want to live? How do I want to live? This is a trial. And is this the way that, I want to emulate, this to my children in a manner of anger? Is that what we do? Because I know what I would tell them, and any time that I'm, sharing advice, especially as my daughter gets older, it's like, well, here's a dose for you and here's one for me, of the truth. And to where, and sometimes that happens, right? And I think that looking back to where, growing up, when we talk about, like, did I have a spiritual home, or, didn't have a spiritual or religious home. but for some reason, like I felt like I had this connection to the heavens. And as that got more refined, it was when I started playing music. I had a best friend down the street who became a best friend. He was an upperclassman. Like even back, when you're in 7th, 8th grade, when someone's a year older and they take you in, yeah. And he was already a fabulous musician, So I had, been starting to play guitar. I think when I was 11, a swap meet guitar, teaching myself. And then by the time I was 13, 14, I was really intrigued by bass players and bass in general.
Let's get in. What bass players? I want to know.
Yeah, well, at that time, where I was getting into a lot of punk rock and hard rock, the first one that comes to mind always is Duff McKagan, Guns N' Roses. Appetite for Destruction had come out, and it was the perfect blend of classic rock and punk rock, which are, my loves. And so that really opened up, this, like, there's the mystique of the bass player,
Did you ever see them live?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they were broken up for years and years and years. I finally got to see them a couple years ago for the first time ever.
Yeah.
Which is amazing.
Yeah. I saw them in, 91.
So you saw them in the heyday when they were like going. Oh,
Use Your Illusion tour, and Soundgarden opened.
Oh my gosh.
Emma and I went, together.
Yeah.
And then I saw the version where it was just Axl with, Tommy Stinson from The Replacements and DJ Ashba, I think, was on guitar, and it was Robin Fink from Nine Inch Nails still.
Wow.
At the Hard Rock, the Joint in Vegas, and then I saw, when they got back, with Slash and Duff. And
I bet they were cooler back in the day. They're old.
No, they're better now.
They are better now?
Oh, yeah. It was cool, but like my real passion became listening to the Jimi Hendrix Experience. So like that would have been Noel Redding on the bass, and then getting into Led Zeppelin, John Paul Jones, and of course Pink Floyd with Roger Waters. So a lot of that, and listening to a lot of like Descendants, Bad Brains, and Black Flag.
I didn't know punk was such an influence for you.
Oh yeah, big time. Cool. Yeah. That's where I cut my teeth. The first band that I was in with this friend down the street, he was playing drums in the group and their bass player was moving. And I think that guy was 19. So if I'm like, I had seen the band. And so to be like pulled in, and they were all like, upperclassmen, where it was like a real initiation. And ultimately I can look at that as, it really opened up, my self-confidence and my self-validation. Up to that point, it was really hard for me to, approach people or to talk to people. I didn't like the sound of my own voice. As I was, 12, 13, I was very androgynous looking. I was growing my hair out. I would have my mom. You couldn't buy skinny jeans back then. I'd have my mom make them, or she would hem my or taper my pants. And so and I remember times where like I remember being out waiting for the bus, and it's early in the morning, so my cheeks are rosy red. I'm wearing this big sweatshirt, these skinny jeans. I get on the bus, and the bus driver says, "Hey, y'all move over so she can sit down." And I'm like, and it's all loud and so, and I'm like, move down now. And I'm like, and of course I felt like it was my, it was my, it was my plight to say like, I'm not a girl.
Did you stand up and say that?
No, I did. And I thought to project my voice over all the kids. Well, all of a sudden the kids get quiet. And here I am at it's the top. I'm not a girl, So everyone's laughing, but I can look back and think about being refined, going through something that's hard, right?
Yeah.
And it takes that to be able to finally say, "This is me," and this is who I. But all the time, people walking up to me, "Hey, they want to know, are you a boy or a girl?" And since I didn't like the way that my voice would sound, I wouldn't project, well, what's your name? Brandy. Oh, Brandy. Oh, right. Hey, one more.
Oh
this
my
is great
gosh.
because my cousin was getting married, and this was a big family wedding. And they had this huge reception at a ballroom in Vegas, it's a full production, and with all these different dances, and so finally it gets to the point where the DJ says, okay, now all you older men out there, now you ask a young lady to dance. And I looked like just
like Pat from SNL.
Exactly. No. Pretty much, yeah. Where I was so butch looking because I had like a nice like dark green dress shirt, but a bolo tie and this long scraggly hair, and I'm talking with my cousins, and some younger, some older, and my cousin's new husband's uncle or some old dude comes over. Young lady, would you like to dance? And I'm like, I'm not a girl. Oh, don't be shy. Come on now. Like, we know you're shy. Come on. And all my dudes around me, they're like, what's happening? And again, let me project. And now it's like all of a sudden, I'm not a girl, and the record skips like, and tumbleweeds go rolling by. Yeah. But it's again that point of like, hey, this is me, and but the real I think opening up for me became doing music. Mm-hmm. So I got to be in this band and started doing shows right away, and I can look back at that as really the opportunity to express myself. To feel confident in doing that, especially as I, being part of a music scene that is very alternative, and meeting so many different people. It was such a great time, especially in Las Vegas. I mean, it's because we're so isolated out there, right?
Yeah.
But you would meet people, you would meet bands that did go and tour, or there were a lot of groups that did come through. And at times there wasn't a venue to play in Vegas because no one would sponsor an all ages venue. So we would get generators and go play in the desert, which really opens up for a free for all.
Yeah, that sounds chaotic.
I mean, by the time I was 14, I'm playing in nightclubs in Vegas, and I found that. Because I remember I had a gig on a Monday night, and we weren't going on till like maybe 11:30. Both my parents are working class. They were always up. My dad sometimes like 4 a.m. to beat the Vegas sun. Mm-hmm. He was actually a journeyman for a sign company that did all the neon lighting in Vegas. Which is cool. Like that was a cool insight for us, to have like, that behind the scenes view. But they were up early, and so they're like, well, we can't come, because we want to go to bed and go to work. So just let us know, like, just get home safe. It's like, wait, so if I have a gig on a school night,
How old were you?
14.
Oh yeah, wow.
I could just say I have a show, and you're not going to come because you have to go to work. So I could just stay out till whenever. Yeah, that was kind of a free pass.
That was how I used camping in high school.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, we went camping a lot, but there was times where we didn't. But
yeah,
we were
because they knew it was something that you do.
Yeah.
But there was something definitely free about the way it was.
The 90s were fun.
Yeah.
It was a good time to be a teenager.
Yeah, and so it was through that, these experiences, especially like I said, like this alternative and punk rock scene, you were going to get called out, if you weren't being yourself. And again,
do you remember how poser was a thing?
Oh yeah,
that was like the 90s was all about the poser.
Oh yeah,
hating on the poser.
People wanted authenticity.
Yeah,
and I can remember like I just never wanted to be pigeonholed. And I remember, I grew up, liking, hard rock and punk rock, and then, into classic rock, like basically anything and everything. But I also as hip hop came around, like I loved that. I mentioned of License to Ill came out, and Run DMC, Raising Hell, so much stuff. But if you like you Vegas and our group of kids loved to pigeonhole people. If you were you couldn't listen to rap if you liked hard rock. Oh, you're not a real rock fan now, And if you were skateboarding, you had to listen to certain music, and you couldn't, oh, you're wearing a Motley Crue shirt? Oh no, who are and they would always say, well, what are you? Are you a skater then? I'm like, yeah, I love to skateboard. Yeah, but are you if you like any hard rock or heavy metal, you were a stoner. And I'm like, what's that even mean? I don't hang out with the kids on the corner that smoke or smoke weed or anything like that.
Having more than one identity was hard for people to grasp.
Oh yeah, and they would they all the time, like, you have to pick one. I'm like, no.
Do you feel like now your identity is like a religious guy and a rock star? Like,
again, still an anomaly. Yeah, big time. And it was this, this refining and this ability to be myself that let me, do the music and to be who I wanted to be. And then of course, when it came time to where I found my next journey, which was joining the church, coming out of this whole scene to where, it was, people are like, wait, you're doing what? And again, having the confidence to say, well, this is what I need, and I can't be held back, even though it's hard, to, I realized that, I had to, I couldn't coexist. I had to, kind of go the journey alone because there were just a lot of friends that weren't supportive of it. There were, just a lot of habits and lifestyle that I was trying to put behind me. But I learned from early on, like all these experiences that, I shared, it's okay for me to just be me,
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you evolve, you go through your music years, your teenage years, you end up joining the church, and you get married, you go on a mission. We've addressed those. And then now
actually I went on a mission, then I got married.
Oh, did I say that backwards?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay, you went on a mission.
I wish. No.
Yeah. That'd be, maybe you'll go on another mission.
I know, I hope.
I don't know. What was the biggest, so you joined the church, that's a big deal to become quote unquote religious, to find God. Like what was the biggest thing from your life previous to your life then after?
Yeah, well, it was, like I mentioned, this kid down the street. His name was Eric Jones, and he was so talented. Like I mentioned that when I met him, he was a guitar player, and then when we started playing together, he was playing drums. He was someone that could play anything, and he really pulled me in. And his parents are amazing, born again Christians, like. They are part of a church that is just, so amazing. And his mom, who is, just really spiritually in tune, grew up on some reservations in New Mexico before coming to Vegas. And she had told Eric, who had told me that I feel Brandon's on a spiritual journey. And thought, wow, like I have been thinking of that because I do know that I feel like there's a higher power. I do feel like I'm, there's something more than me, and I found out that they went to church on Sundays and there was a band there, and learning bits and pieces of, that there is that people believe that God is real and that the Son of God, Jesus Christ, is, someone that lived in a way that we can emulate, and ultimately the best thing that I just always felt this, even though I didn't, know how to define it, that God's not dead, that Jesus, isn't gone, like, just like the story goes that he, rose on the third day. And, I just felt like the heavens were open. but I didn't know how to tap into that or even like what that meant. And this family kind of helped me to see that, a little bit. And as much as, we wanted to at the time as young teenagers. And, but I remember my friend Eric just always had he always revered, God, that there was so like he was aware. And even though we did crazy, silly things, there was a line, and I think that kind of got me ready for when I met Emily and started meeting other LDS friends. That for me, the big connection was music. That we were all into the same music and going to shows together. But now here are kids that have these standards. They seem to have a foundation, because really at that time, while I was becoming aware, that I wanted a relationship with God, I put all my faith in music. That's ultimately where I got my, my inspiration, my peace, my motivation, and especially playing music. And if we had a gig that week that fell through, I was just crushed. And I remember just feeling just empty. I'm like, man, this isn't right. Like what? And I just saw these kids that even, when they went through stuff, there was a foundation that they only went so low. And I thought, well, it's got to be that church, and because like with, at the time with, my current church and beliefs, yeah, we wanted to be in tune, but it wasn't, we didn't apply any of that to the way we lived, except for not taking the Lord's name in vain, like it was very, but I saw these other kids that were refined, but it wasn't sterile, because there's that idea, right? That's like, oh, you're part of this church and you're brainwashed, and it's like you're so vanilla, right? Yeah. And that wasn't the case, I just saw personality and creativity and it was so vivid, and as Emily and I, started dating, eventually, she asked me, what do you think the purpose of life is? Here's a 16-year-old kid, asking another, and for me, like I said, it was, I didn't have any spiritual structure in home. I remember I had I had made a collage of some Van Halen clippings from when I was like 11 or 10 or 11. And one of them was a quote from Eddie Van Halen, like, life is a party and it's meant to have a good time, and, and it wasn't them with, like a bunch of beer cans. It was him with a guitar, and, whereas like, that's the party to me, and, but, she says, well, what do you think of, maybe this being down here on the earth is, maybe part of a test to learn how to live and to get a body and to, maybe where we could live in heaven again and be part of something bigger, Like, she's dropping knowledge, right? Yeah. Like I can remember exactly where we were driving, like in Vegas, like that's one of those moments, right? And it's something where I just started to see more and more, clearly I had I always think that there's two conversions, there's a social conversion and a spiritual conversion. And certainly, I was socially converted, first. And, but I wanted to learn more. So I started going to seminary, and in Vegas, that was in the morning, that was, getting up at 6 a.m., 5:45, doing that and going to a youth conference. And, I wouldn't meet with the missionaries because I thought at the time that if you do that, you're agreeing to get baptized and to join. And, I couldn't do it if I wasn't 100%. And I was still like deeply rooted in, my other life, with my friends. And I did see some friends that tried to, maybe they got involved, for a girlfriend or a boyfriend. and 3 months later, they're out. Or even, hey, we want you to play on our church basketball team, but you have to be a member of our ward.
That was you. Someone said that?
People would do that.
Oh, wow.
And they would join, and they would do that, and, so I for sure it was, I'm not going to say I'm part of something that I'm not really, if my heart's not in it.
Right.
But once I knew that I wanted to, it was really about, how can I align my life, with a life that will, just habits and practices, that will help me to grow and put me in a situation to have that connection with God. And the biggest experience that I had with that was, we were discussing the belief of, a pre-existence of living in the heavens before coming here to earth. And when we talked about that and they were sharing this with me, I didn't feel like I was learning it for the first time. I felt like this is something that I know. I know this, and it's like this, this veil or this, this blanket had come off of my mind, at this corner of my mind, and it was just, so amazing. One thing that helped, with these discussions is we would have them actually at Emily's parents' house. She was there sometimes, but not all the times. Again, like I couldn't have this just be about her, even though she was a great influence. But the spirit that was there in their home, and when we talk about being refined and going through things, they had gone through a lot to get their home in that way. And I took all this information and I just took time. I wanted to ponder and really, make sure this was for me. And that led into, after high school to where my friends that I had made that, were part of the church were gone on missions. Others, including Emily, had moved off to college out of state. And to where I had a lot of self-exploration, and where I remember, hey, okay, if I'm going to do this, like, not only, do I want to, know and believe this, but I want to live it. It's asking me to, to really change my lifestyle. And, no more drinking with the friends, no more smoking pot, doing everything else. Right. I won't go over the list, but, it was a lot. And, but I did that. And I remember I was working this job. I worked for a factory that supplied souvenirs to Vegas souvenir shops.
Very important industry.
Keychains, decks of cards, pens, all
essential goods. Yes.
All the fun stuff. And I remember driving home from that, and I thought, well, the one connection that I have, who I like to bounce stuff off of, and he was there during all these discussions, was Emily's dad. He was also a convert to the church, both her parents, as teenagers. And, I'd built a friendship with him, and thought, okay, I've been really pondering and praying about this. I know I want to do it. But if I go there and talk to him and say, I'm going to do this, I can't, I have to be sure. Mm-hmm. And when it came time to make the turn on the street, if I was going to go there, it's just like the wheel just turned, and I went and I said, hey, you know what? I think
Jesus took the wheel.
Yeah, exactly. And I said, hey, I think I'm ready. And he, we had a great conversation, and he shared the one thing that I remember him sharing is, remember that while there's a lot of celebration and positivity around this, that it's not all peaches and cream. Your life is still going to have, struggles and hardships, but this is what's going to help you to get through those, and will help you discern, how you're going to go about that. Now circling back to the beginning, we talked about, how do we decide that we want to, how do I want to live my life? If I'm busy with, trying to build this entertainment, I guess, mecca, or basically, building a band is like building another brand or company, but while doing that, I still want to be involved in my family. I still want to, be spiritually minded, make sure that, I don't slip from that. And
this is what I want to know. I look up to you, and I've seen you go through some really hard things over the last couple of years, and your life has not been easy. Has been super exciting, and I'm in the music industry, and I've always been like super stoked on the neon trees. Elaine's one of my best friends.
Yeah.
And so looking at you and seeing this like seemingly awesome life, I'm like, yeah, Brandon's just such a good guy, and your family's close knit, your wife is amazing. So I know that there's decisions that you're making that's going on behind the scenes, and that's what I want to know. Like when these challenges are happening in your life in the day to day, where are you getting your strength? Like where's Branden Campbell? Like what's the nitty gritty of like your day-to-day help? What are you reading? Does that make sense? That's right. What I just want to know. Like,
yeah, definitely. I think the biggest thing that I can rely on is forgiveness. Looking at, it's so easy to think the atonement applies to everyone else except me. Mm-hmm. Until you get really old, and then it only applies to me and no one else. No. It's it's forgiveness in myself, right? And others, and I can think of times to where it has been hard to just it's not hard to want to stay on the gospel path, right? The want has always been there, fortunately, Mm-hmm. And I can, I'm so grateful that as I got involved in the church, and one of the reasons why I knew I had to be 100% is because I said, hey, if I do this, I'm of age, I want to go on a mission. Like, this is the time. Mm-hmm. And I'm so grateful that I did that, because that became the guide for everything else in my life.
How so?
Well, I had a wonderful mission president who at the time was 44 years old, with still with a couple kids, and by trade he was a psychologist, but also happened to be a director of church education up in Canada, and was hilarious. Mind you, now I've been part of this for like 18 months. I'm going to absorb all this, while sharing it. And he had such a great influence on me because he had such a great everyday, just attitude of, just don't be spiritually weird, and don't be weird. Yeah. Don't be weird. And, it's where there was just so much practical application and so much realness to it, to where he just had a way of teaching the gospel in a way to where, I can still implement it into my life. And this is the best part of it, is remembering that anything that's important to me is important to the Lord. There's not a disconnection between, I can't pray for that because, it's fun, or it's, I make money from that, mm-hmm. Why should I think that God doesn't care about my work, or the events I do with my family, any of these things. So what I'm saying is to not separate, my church life from my everyday life, that it's all one life, and to take that with me everywhere that I went. So
I'm glad you said that, because I'm reading this book, and it's featuring Lou Gehrig. And I didn't know much about Lou Gehrig, but he lived a very clean, very methodical, baseball was the end all be all. And which was a very stark difference between Babe Ruth, who had a terrible diet, smoked, drank.
Lives forever, then Lou Gehrig gets sick, right?
Yeah, but he also, Lou Gehrig set all these records and had this great life. And I was thinking, like, does God care about baseball? And then right when I thought that, because Lou Gehrig could have done with the principles he lived, he could have done amazing things if you're living just this really disciplined, good life. But I had this thought: does God care about baseball? And I said, of course he cares, but he cares more about how you live your life, because how Lou Gehrig lived his life, because he was a big, amazing baseball player, I'm now inspired. Like, I really have been inspired by Lou Gehrig. Yeah. I'm inspired by you, and we're in the music business, but that's how I connected with you. If I wasn't in the music business, I don't know that I would even know you. Yeah. And so I really believe that God does care about what we love. And so thank you for sharing that. I think that's so important, that hobbies are important. Your interests are important.
It's easy to feel conflicted, right?
Like, God created you. He created you to be curious and to, like, explore and to want to do these things that might not make money, might not do this, but if it brings you joy and happiness and you're living a good life, you can then influence people who are interested in these things. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that's a really cool principle, to not be ashamed of like getting into hobbies or doing something that might not seem important, but God does care about your interests.
Yeah.
So that's cool.
That he wants to be part of our whole life, and we need to let him in to do that. Yeah. And that's something that I always vowed to do when I started a family, and getting more involved in music. I actually tried not doing music because my idea of what the music business was full of debauchery and this riotous living, because that's all I saw, And I had to separate myself from that, and thinking, well, no, I need to go get a dignified job, as if there are no, bad lawyers or doctors or,
there's not,
cops, right? There's no cops that speed. There's no doctors that smoke or lawyers that lie. But I was conflicted, because I wanted to be part of music, but I thought, no, I need to bridle my passions. And so I went through this. I went through this period of where, no, I need to put it away and, not give into that, because I also didn't want to be a starving artist that, would make my family sacrifice more than they needed to because of, I had this drive for something that, at the time still was like, how does anyone even get a record deal? Mm-hmm. Where else do you make money? And all we saw then was either bands and clubs or on the Grammys on TV, to where I thought, no, I want to do this, but eventually, when I started doing it, I always vowed I'm going to include my family as much as I can, where I would bring, when appropriately timed, bring my kids on tour or even out for a weekend, where my wife's always got access. Like, no one ever wonders if I'm married or not, or anything like that. My wife is never wondering what I'm up to. One important thing I always made sure to have happen is my wife would find out any news, exciting or bad, before reading it somewhere else. Yeah.
That's cool.
Yeah. And just always on the, on the up with that. To where, it's like, I just want to be myself, and to where it's okay to do that. Like, I love that. This is what I loved about getting involved with Neon Trees. Like, I loved, and especially Tyler was good at radiating this. There wasn't that cynical, I can't be caught trying attitude that was going on in music at the time. Like, you stand and you stare at your pedal board, and anything more, you're egocentric, and where all of a sudden it's like, no, like, let's have fun and channel something, and it's okay. Like, let's bring something. And I saw that to where it's kind of like, I love the NBA, and baseball. You know, like those are my two favorite sports. But I know I can't do that. So, but I can live vicariously through this. And I see, well, I think people get that same thing from coming to concerts sometimes.
Yeah, totally.
You know? And so, yeah, like let's have fun with that. But, you know, to where it's like, well, I can't do that authentically if people know that I'm a family man. You know, it's like, again, this is from the years of going through things that taught me to where I'm just going to be myself, you know, and sometimes if that seems against the grain, you know, and a lot of that sometimes is in our heads too, where we think how a situation is or what other people are going to think, you know, trying to let go of that. I remember, like, you know, going on tour and thinking like, okay, how are we going to gel with other bands if we're not, you know, if we don't want to go to the club afterwards, or we're not all like, you know, raging.
Yeah.
And is this going to be an issue, or are people going to, you know, feel like we're just like a wet blanket? And it was completely opposite. It was so many people that were, you know, also looking to be healthy, you know, and to, you know, just to live their best life, and had already, you know, had gone, you know, had gone a couple rounds, you know, around the sun a couple times, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
To where you realize like, hey, like I want to do something different, and that doesn't make you less of a rocker, you know?
Yeah.
If anything, you know, it gives you the ability to do more of that. And I loved that we could apply that work ethic with our group, because as we did start to get you know, involved in you know, recording music and getting a record contract, and then radio gets involved, we never intended like, hey, we're going to write a song that's going to be on the radio. And first thing that happens is, hey, come play the morning show. Well, you just did a gig the night before, you know, however many miles away. You get to bed at 4 a.m. Okay, well, yeah, 7:15, you know, and you know, and it's time to turn it on, right, and be yourselves. We always showed up, and
You guys are hustlers.
and talking to, you know, our radio reps, and to where eventually all of a sudden there's a thank you. It's like, well, you know, no, thank you. Like, we're out here doing this. Like, you're helping us. So no, there's so many people that won't show up. They won't wake up, and they won't show, and then they complain, why aren't we on the radio?
Yeah.
And, or they'll make up reasons why, oh, I can't get up because of this or that. And they say, fool, I was at the club with you last night.
Yeah.
You know, and so, you know, I'm here for better or worse. It's always wearing my heart on my sleeve.
Yeah.
And
You do a good job at that.
you know, and so, yeah, sometimes where it's, you know, I might share more that, you know, there's people that are interested, and some that are like, you know, that's more than I need to know, or more than I would share, you know. I don't feel compelled to do that, especially as we're in this social media age. And again, having teenagers and helping them realize that it's okay to know that no one is meant to have that much access to your life. You know, it's not normal.
It's not normal.
It's not normal. And you don't have to, you know, feel like you're, you know, and again, of course, that pressure to be showing your best life, you know, where we're cropping out everything else, and where it's created this this idea that everyone else is doing better, and you know, like, and now all of a sudden, you know, we don't want to share what's really going on because we're embarrassed in comparison. But then when we finally do get vulnerable, and we say, "Oh wow," like, because you know, I've been going through the same thing, you know, or something similar. You know? Yeah. And, you know, it's been hard, and, you know, it's easy to assume that, you know, behind the scenes that everything is, you know, just perfect, and that we're just this, you know, put together, you know, awesome family that's just, you know, we're always in our church meetings, and you know, yeah, we deal with Connor, but we do it with a smile, and everyone loves him, and no, man, there's the struggles, you know. You know, I was born with a bicuspid heart valve, which eventually I knew would have to be replaced. And so about 10 years ago, I got a mechanical valve put in, which was planned, but for the type of valve they wanted to do at that time, they had to go through the front. So it was like open heart surgery, and the recovery from that was intense. I had never taken pain medication before. I was also at the time was trying to figure out like any diagnosis with maybe like some depression and antidepressants. But all of a sudden I'm taking these pills. I'm like, wow, I feel better. And even though like all my experience in my teen years and early on, of all the things I did, I'd never dealt with addiction. But I stopped taking the pills because it was time. All of a sudden I felt sick, and I'm like, well, now I definitely need an antidepressant because now I feel like way down in the dumps. And all of a sudden I realized, like, wait, I know what this is. My body's addicted. Well, I know how we talk about addicts. And I know, and that's like the whole stigma around it to where it becomes, it's just easier just to keep taking them, and that became a battle, to where, and some time ago, like I wouldn't even talk about it.
Like, did you consider yourself an addict at the time?
Oh yeah. Yeah,
okay.
Definitely. Yeah. But I even remember, prior to that, thinking like, oh, I would never get addicted, because
it's very easy to think that.
I didn't really know anyone that had.
Yeah.
I didn't have any experience. I'd never been, never been in, even aware of pills. Like looking back, I can think of like when Emily, I mentioned she had to have back surgery after Katie was born, and I can remember huge bottles of probably some strong stuff. Like looking back, and she, after a while, I just didn't even take them. And I think eventually, like she gave them to her dad that like put them in a safe or whatever. Like, but that was like just being aware, like, wasn't even a thing of like, oh, those are in our house, like, or, because that wasn't a situation for her, know? So but that was like any time that I've ever had like, even anything like that in our home. But for me, it was, I think a lot of it too was because I was dealing with something else, this trying to diagnose this depression, to where there was just a lot of blurry lines within that. And it was hard. And I realized that the only way that I can get through this is if I'm open about it. And
like, how long had you been addicted before you decided this?
It had been, it was like on and off. So, looking back then, it was probably like, almost a year,
Yeah.
And it's something to where the hardest thing was, I was afraid of letting people down because now I was, again, like now I'm getting recognition, for our work, but I'm also in a field that, like I said, that lots of times has this reputation, for being such a party time. And there are people that do that and are even just responsible with it. Like they're grown-ups, that's fine. I don't have an issue with that.
Yeah.
But for people to say, hey, like you're such a good example because, we know that you don't, you wave a different flag. And so I thought, oh, well, now like, I'm going to be a jerk. Right.
Did you feel like you were going to let people down coming out with it?
Oh yeah. Yeah. It would be embarrassing, I
mean, did you plan on going, like, how public did you want?
Oh, no, I didn't,
because I didn't know this until now.
Yeah. No, this was, it was just on a need to know basis.
Yeah. Sure.
But then I realized like, hey, like I need to let people in, to help me, and Yeah, to where it's and it was a hard thing that ultimately, because it wasn't something that, it wasn't me, trying to have this other life and like going to live at the bar, right? Or trying to get away from my life and where I'm self-medicating, or with drink or drugs. This was me wanting to be part of my life, like wanting to be a dad, wanting to still attend my church meetings and be involved, and to be on top of my craft, everything, and just to get that, there was this block like in my head that was this fog, and forever. Thinking like it's depression, and that's what it is. And so it turns to, now, fighting that and realizing eventually, oh, well, this whole time we've been chasing the wrong thing, that I ended up with a diagnosis of ADHD. And to where like all of a sudden I do like a 360, my head does, like in The Jerk when Steve Martin gets that first big check.
How did you decide to open up? What was the final catalyst that gave you the courage?
Again, just wanting to be me.
Okay.
That's
a common theme.
Well, it's two things. It's wanting to be myself, and also knowing that there's someone out there like me that's saying like, I can't talk about this, because it goes like this. It goes like, I can say, hey, I tore my ACL, and currently it's I'm in repair, I'm on the injured list, but all of a sudden, once you're back, well, that's the focus, right? But we think anytime that we bring up anything concerned with mental health, or addiction, alcoholism, any of those struggles. There's people that obviously struggle, with pornography, stuff like that. To say, hey, this is something that even like I'm dealing with, and then, fast forward, they're not, but there's this idea like, oh, well, that's person is that now.
That's their story.
They're going to think of me as that, right? Yeah. And we don't allow ourselves to be seen in other ways, and we think that it's our minds like to lie to it. It's a trick, but it happens. So it's like, well, I better not say anything because I don't want to be labeled.
Which makes it worse because the shame spiral is just worse and worse. Yeah.
But and I can think back to a couple situations where I had a counselor that was helping me out, and she was talking about her, the way her life had turned around, and eventually getting involved in her ward, and the bishop saying, "Hey, I think we want you to speak to the ward," and it's like, oh, no one would want to hear from me, like. I've done this, and this, and like, and he said, well, do you really think that's who you are? That's what you did, something you did, but that's not who you are. And he said, well, why would they want to hear from me then? And she's like, what do you mean? It's like, yeah, I spent 2 years in a Chinese prison for drug smuggling, decades ago. Mm-hmm. Another Steve Martin headspin for her, right? Yeah. To think, but I don't see you that way. You're not like, to where people can really, be refined and really change, right? And it takes work. It takes time, I have another friend of mine that went through a big, pill addiction struggle, and had, turned things around. And when I see this person, I don't think, oh, there's the drug guy. Yeah. I think, oh, this is this is someone that's successful and a great friend. And
do you think that when?
But then I think, well, someone wouldn't think that of me. They're going to think this other thing. It's like bull crap, dude. I'm rejecting that. Okay, I'm rejecting that, and so I want other people to know and to feel comfortable, and and just start allowing others to say, hey, you can talk about your struggles with it. There is TMI and there's a place and, a time for it. But it's, when you're ready, that you are, but it's okay to have those discussions. Because I'm grateful that, like people that I mentioned, have shared stuff, and there's so many more, that are even closer to me, that if they hadn't opened up, to where then I wouldn't have had that, that courage and faith to where I could see myself as, well, we can get past this,
You said, you talked earlier about forgiveness, and that was your source of strength in getting through hard times, forgiving yourself. And it seems to me that when you forgive yourself and you admit something's wrong and you overcome it, that you are so much more forgiving in not labeling someone or seeing their faults.
Oh, yeah.
Would you agree with that?
Yeah, big time. And because, again, going back to like the stigma of the way that we, talk about people that are in a certain, space in their life.
Right.
And, where's the empathy, and to realize like there's so much more to that person, so it's that paradigm shift of allowing myself to see it differently, not to deny that things have happened or to hide from it. That's a different thing. It's we have to address things, and we have to, deal with the hard stuff. And it's like, when you're, if you haven't played guitar for a while, or bass, and you need to get your calluses back, you just got to do it. Like, I don't play upright bass as much as I like to, but when I do, when I have a project coming up and I'm getting back into it, those are different calluses, but I'm not going to put on gloves. It's like I have to go through with it, and then I'm glad that I did. You know, and that's what it is. Like everything that we deal with, it's owning our stuff, right? When I say sharing too much, where if I don't tell everyone all the time that I've gone through this is who I am, then I'm not validating myself, or I'm a phony. It's like no. Not everyone needs to know. No. And that doesn't mean that you're denying that it happened or you're hiding something or you're shady or anything like that. It's not about that. But in the time and place, when you can have those, a conversation like this, and even knowing like, hey, this is going to be aired and shared.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And it's for that purpose of, hey, this is me. And as I talk about these things and process these things, the more that I do that, it is cathartic. And also, that as other people hear it, that they can, kind of get that courage to say, hey, like, this, I can get through this,
right.
Or I shouldn't beat myself up, or, I should give, my partner or, my friend or my son or my dad, like whoever, I should give them a break,
Well, hopefully. Yeah.
Or I bet they need to talk about this, and it's, I think a lot of us were raised with parents that, were from a generation of, you just don't talk about those things.
Well, I'm glad we're talking today. This is my takeaways. This is what I love learning from you today is forgiveness, how important that is for yourself and others. Courage to be yourself, which seemed to get you through your teenage years. And then you talked continually about refining and like trusting that God's plan is good for you and letting him refine you to find that joy. Yeah. So, those are beautiful messages. So thank you so much.
No, thank you, man. That's like, I was honored to be invited and, to be able to, like I said, talk about these things. It's important.